In the year 2022, access to movies and TV shows is at an all-time high. Streaming services are raking in money, and with so many avenues for release, many filmmakers are now able to put their visions out into the world. With so many subjects to tackle within visual mediums, it's no surprise that mental illness has been the focus of many a movie. However, representation of these mental illnesses can widely vary from respectful to fully exploitative. However, one of the genres of movies that manages to tackle the topic in a unique way within the past few years is horror. Horror is such a broad genre that it has to be broken down into countless subgenres, from the chainsaw and knife-wielding killers of slasher horror to the grainy, shaky, personal scares of found footage. If you can think of it, chances are there's a horror movie based around the concept. While many titles released can be categorized as simple schlock designed to provide the audience with a fun experience, other films have taken the medium of horror and used it to portray deep and thoughtful topics. One such theme is the aforementioned topic of mental illness, which has always had representation in horror. However, it hasn't always been, let's say, great in its portrayal. So let's dive in.
Don't worry. He's not allowed to touch you. He knows what you're here for. He listens to me.
First, some background. Much of horror's history in handling mental health has always been using it as a trope. It's typically depicted as a plot device that provides context for the evil psycho who's murdering helpless teens. Unfortunately, this representation more often than not just comes down to lazy writing. But because this depiction has become so prevalent, it continues to perpetuate the various stigmas surrounding mental health. It's because of these stigmas that it has taken so long for people to broach the subject, and even keeping that in mind, we are still a long way from full destigmatization. It has only recently been, in the past few years, that horror has begun to tackle the topic with more tact, using thoughtfully crafted characters within interesting stories. That's not to say there hasn't been good representation pre-2010s, but let's just say they're few and far between. So let's talk a little bit about the history of mental illness depictions in horror. Mental illness depicted within horror can be seen as far back as the creation of the genre within cinema. Specifically 1920s German silent horror film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Widely held by many to be the first ever horror film created, the story focuses on an evil hypnotist who controls a somnambulist in order to commit murders. The main character attempts to stop the man, but in a dramatic twist it is revealed that our protagonist is actually a delusional asylum inmate who has hallucinated the entire story up to this point. Now, this twist has become one of the most popular horror tropes of all time, that of the unreliable narrator twist. The audience follows the main character through their journey, sympathizing with their struggles, only to realize that they've been unreliable since the very beginning. For our purposes, however, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was one of, if not the, first horror film to associate mental health with the idea of a person being criminally insane or evil. This idea is now spread like wildfire until the two have become virtually synonymous within the world of horror movies. Now, another famous example is Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 genre-defining slasher, Psycho. Once again, at the end of the film, it is revealed that the main antagonist's crimes stem from dissociative identity disorder. Psycho uses this mental illness as simply an explanation as to why Norman Bates acts the way he does. Multiple studies over the years have shown that there is little to no link between those who suffer from DID and violent actions. Again, this is a major case where a character's mental health conditions are used to establish a sort of reasoning behind their actions. And despite this apparently being a major part of Bates' motivation within the film, the audience is never shown this in any way. Instead, we are simply told that he suffers from DID without any understanding of how the disorder truly affects those who suffer from it. It's this portrayal of mental illness leading to violence that unfortunately has become the norm for horror movies within the following decades. They use it as a plot device without explaining anything about it. But now to move on to the good. Within the past decade, there seems to have been a shift within the horror community, and many movies with thoughtful and carefully researched depictions of mental illness have begun to emerge. Foremost among them is Jennifer Kent's 2014 film, The Babadook. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's already been dissected and broken down countless times by people much more qualified than myself, but to briefly touch upon it, the movie focuses on our main character dealing with the titular Babadook, a tall and pale monster that is revealed to be the physical representation of the grief and depression that our main character is forced to live with after the tragic death of her husband. The film carefully explores the emotions and the struggles that come with such emotional states and the real mental and physical toll that they can exert. Our protagonist is barely able to sleep, struggling to make it through her workday, and has difficulty performing everyday tasks. She simply exists, her grief causing her to simply slog forward through her life. But the most interesting part of the movie, at least to me, is that instead of the main character killing and defeating the Babadook in the end, she simply learns that it's something she has to live with. The pain and the grief that she has gone through will always be a part of her, but she can live with it. Now, to me, this is one of the best portrayals of mental illness within horror because it acknowledges the fact that people simply just can't get over their depression or mental illness. It's a long process that takes time and growth, and there's no simple cure, so it makes sense for the beast to not be so easily dispatched. Now, I'm not alone in thinking this. Many other people have commented on this movie's themes and how it tackles mental illness in a very thoughtful and respectful way. But moving on, I want to leave you with one recommendation of my own. An underrated television show that is equal parts thought-provoking and disturbing. So, let's talk about Channel Zero. Premiering on the Sci-Fi Channel in 2016, Channel Zero pretty much flew under the radar. Now, Sci-Fi greenlit 12 episodes, which were eventually split into 2 separate 6-episode story arcs. Each season takes elements from creepypastas, and is a self-contained miniseries that actually received pretty favorable reviews. As I mentioned, each season is based on a different creepypasta. These are internet-based horror stories or images that manage to propagate through various online channels and eventually become horror legends. Now, Channel Zero takes these and translates them into a more visual medium. Almost every review of the 4 seasons is favorable, but despite this, the show isn't very popular. This can most likely be attributed to the fact that it premiered with little to no advertisements on cable TV, as opposed to Netflix and other streaming services which were in the midst of a meteoric rise in popularity. With that bit of backstory out of the way, I want to touch on one of the reasons why I love Channel Zero. The show thoughtfully and interestingly portrays mental illness throughout almost every season in one way or another. It's clear that while these monsters are very real and very dangerous threats to our main character, they also double as dark and twisted manifestations of the problems that they have to deal with. Now, I have to hold myself back because I could honestly talk about this show for hours, all the different monsters and characters and what they could represent, but to keep it brief, the season I'll focus on is Season 3, Butcher's Block.
Don't you just want to be taken care of?
Based on one of my all-time favorite creepypastas, the Search and Rescue series of stories by author Carrie Hammond, which I highly recommend you to read. I'll leave a link in the description. The show follows 2 sisters, Alice and Zoe, portrayed by Olivia Luccardi and Holland Roden respectively, as they move into the small and seemingly quiet southern town of Butcher's Block. Before long, it is revealed to the audience that Zoe is struggling with schizophrenia genetically passed down from her mother, and the show handles this topic in a surprisingly respectful way for a random cable TV show. It doesn't portray her to be the stereotypical crazy or evil. It just shows a realistic depiction of what dealing with schizophrenia looks like in an everyday situation. Her sister Alice also has to deal with keeping down a job while battling her own anxiety about the possible and very likely onset of schizophrenia within herself. The 2 sisters' shared trauma of what their mother, and now Zoe, has to deal with is really highlighted in the show in a unique way. The bond that the 2 share is readily evident, and this makes the viewer all the more invested when the 2 sisters are forced to confront the dark secrets that the town holds, while simultaneously dealing with their own personal mental health issues. Now, these monsters that the sisters face are manifested as grotesque creatures with malformed and enlarged heads. But with all the horrifying monsters and the mysterious Peach family that seems to be behind it all in the town, the show is unrelenting. While most shows would end as soon as the 2 women emerge on the other side of a harrowing situation, seemingly saved, Butcher's Block reminds audiences of the mental toll that dealing with events like the ones that these 2 have gone through takes upon a person. It's the way that the characters' actions contrast with the real-world struggles that Zoe and Alice face that really made me want to talk about this show. We might not have to face down horrifying spider creatures or mutated meat monsters in the Deep South, but all of us are eventually going to have to deal with tough situations, and while some people may have it more difficult than others, the representation in this show, especially of mental illness and the harrowing situations that the two go through, is really thoughtful and interesting. The way that they represent the insidious onset of mental illness and the sense of helplessness that one suffering from it can feel really permeates the entire show and elevates the horror in a way that doesn't feel exploitative. Now, I highly recommend you check this one out for yourself. I don't want to spoil too much. All 4 seasons are streaming on Shudder now, which is honestly a horror lover's paradise, so definitely give them a look. Like I mentioned, all of the seasons actually deal with different mental health challenges, and I honestly struggled to pick a favorite season because they're all great in such unique ways. I might be making more videos on this topic because honestly, each season is so great and is really interesting in ways that you don't really see in mainstream horror. So please give them a watch and drop a comment to let me know what you think about the show if you've seen it. Thank you so much for watching if you've made it this far. I'm glad I got the chance to tackle a subject that's very close to my heart. As someone who's personally struggled with mental illness and is currently on medication, it means a lot to me to see the way that these artists have started to abolish the stigma surrounding mental health within horror as a genre. I hope you learned something new about mental illness and the way that it's been portrayed within film and especially horror films throughout the years. Definitely check out Channel Zero and let me know your thoughts on the video within the comments. Thanks for watching, and stay spooky, horror fans.